My name is OJ Stewart, and I'm a presidential intern here at John Jay and also senior student. And it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you this event, Gun Violence, What We Know, and What We Know Works, which is also part of our semester-long series, Gun Violence Initiative. These series of events are focusing on how gun violence affects individuals, families, and also communities, but from a more interdisciplinary approach. The conversation this afternoon will be will be spearheaded by the esteemed Professor David Kennedy, and who is also a director of the National Network for Safe Communities. Mr. Kennedy and the National Network support cities implementing strategic interventions to reduce violence, minimize arrest and incarceration, enhance policy legitimacy, and strengthen relationships between law enforcement and communities. These interventions have been proven effective in a variety of settings by a Campbell collaboration evaluation and are currently being implemented in Chicago, New Orleans, Baltimore, Oakland, and many other cities nationwide. Mr. Kennedy's work has won 2 Ford Foundation Innovations in Government Awards, among many other distinctions. His latest book, Don't Shoot, One Man, A Street Fellowship, and the End of Violence in Inner City America. And I saw a gentleman actually walked in with your book, I believe, yeah. I saw you with a copy of his book. It's a good read, right? Please join me, guys, in welcoming Professor Kennedy and the panel.
Debating between afternoon and evening. I'm going to go with evening. Good evening, everybody. So, welcome to this series. John Jay, I'm happy to say, is a fine college that's part of a fine university that cares deeply about practice. And this series on guns in America is prime John Jay. This is an important issue. We're happy to be able to bring some folks together. We're happy to be able to be a presence in the New York and national conversation on this. So, welcome. This is part of a series. We've had bad luck with the weather, unfortunately, so a couple of the scheduled events have been snowed out. I know they're working to reschedule those. There have been 1 or 2, and my understanding is the next one is April 6th, so this coming week, and it will be right here in this room, a TED Talk on the topic. Is Bettina still with us? So I want to thank Bettina Munster in the President's Office, who's really made all of this happen, and I want to thank my colleague, Heather Conley, who has made this happen. So thanks, Heather. So I have a panel of esteemed colleagues and, more than that, friends here to partake. So on my left here is Thomas Apt. Thomas is currently at the Kennedy School of Government and now at the law school, right? Where he is working on exactly these issues and comes to us from a high-ranking post in the United States Department of Justice, where he worked on these issues, and more recently, Deputy Director of Public Safety here in New York State, where, among other things, he had a hand in designing a principal hand in designing and launching the statewide GIVE project on addressing gun violence using evidence-based practices. One of those sites is Newburgh, and with us is Isabel Rojas, who was a career NYPD officer and is now the project director for the GIVE gun violence prevention strategy working out of the DA's office in Newburgh. And Ted Alcorn, who's the director of innovations at Everytown for gun safety based here in New York, which is one of, if not maybe the most ambitious and effective national gun violence prevention and gun control organizations. So we're each going to take about 20 minutes and speak our piece, and then we'll have the remaining 40 minutes or so for discussion. Does that work for everybody? Okay. So I'm going to kick off And as stated, I am the director of the National Network for Safe Communities here at John Jay. And the National Network does hands-on applied violence prevention work. So we work in the most troubled neighborhoods around the country. Our first work was in homicide. In practice in the United States, homicide is a gun violence problem. So we have been working on applied gun violence strategies for over 20 years now. And where I want to begin on this is that for a certain kind of gun violence, there are now approaches that we know are effective. That, until historically, relatively recently, was not true. So I've been involved in this kind of work since the mid-1980s. I was drawn into it because of the violence associated with the American crack epidemic. That was when we saw the single worst national increase in homicide and gun violence ever nationally. And at that time, there was nothing that we knew worked. So people put a lot of energy into law enforcement. People put a lot of energy into various kinds of community work. None of them were effective. I come out of a especially community and problem-oriented policing background. And at the time in policing, both scholars of police and police practitioners were explicit about their conviction that there was nothing that the police could do about this kind of violence. Right? Police patrolled, they answered 911 calls, they did rapid response, they did investigations after the fact, and none of those standard methods worked for homicide. And so homicide was a crime of passion. It often happened inside and not outside. You really couldn't patrol against it. You couldn't predict it. It happened spontaneously and suddenly, and by the time somebody called 911 and a unit showed up, it was too late. And most murderers are not serial killers, so even when you solve the case, you don't do much to prevent the next one. And everybody knew that you couldn't do anything about people killing each other. That's not true anymore. And so what I want to do for my time today is sketch what we now know about violence and what that has led to in terms of practical steps. So the first thing I want to do in that regard is to distinguish two kinds of gun violence. So the kind that in the last little while in our political and public discourse that has been getting the most attention is what we might call spree shootings. So that's Newtown, Paducah, Virginia Tech, Columbine, those sorts of horrific events that research seems to show are increasing. The sense one has that this is getting worse seems to be borne out by the evidence as time goes by. These are becoming more frequent. They are horrific. And so in rooms like this, unfortunately, one has in the back of one's mind the possibility that somebody might stroll in and terrible things will happen. The spree shootings have provoked the first national conversation about gun violence and gun control that really occupied a major part of public discourse for quite a long time, really since the violence of the crack era started to ebb. And it has led to a policy discourse and a political process around that policy discourse that has focused on a set of important issues. Right? So it has talked about the sorts of weapons that are typically involved in spree shootings. So military appearing weapons, large magazines, that kind of thing. It's brought a conversation about mental health and mental illness and the possible association of those things with those who do these terrible things. It has brought a revival of a conversation about the market in firearms and how people get guns, and about, for you specialists, the difference between the federally regulated primary market, the federally unregulated secondary market that includes but is not limited to gun shows and things like that, and to background checks and that sort of thing. And in the last presidential administration, there was the first significant high-level political push for new gun control action, especially in the wake of the massacre in Newtown, which, while it occupied a good deal of space in our discourse, ultimately did not lead to much in the way of meaningful action. Right? So I said I was going to distinguish between two kinds of gun violence. That's one kind of gun violence. It is unquestionably important, and I'm going to distinguish that from another kind of gun violence in a second. What I do not want to do is either get drawn into or appear to be making a clear distinction between an issue that matters and an issue that does not. Because what I'm about to say is there is a profound empirical, numerical distinction between these two kinds of gun violence. That does not mean that one matters and the other doesn't. It does mean that we should recognize that they're different, and we should think about the ways in which each should matter to us. Because the numerical distinction between that kind of spree shooting gun violence and the rest of the gun violence in the country is that that kind of gun violence represents something less than 1% of all gun homicide in the nation. We don't actually have the best data on this, and some of what we do know comes from the work of Ted and his colleagues and those like them at Everytown and similar organizations. There is no formal governmental or statistical definition of a spree shooting. The FBI tracks what they call mass shootings, which by FBI convention is any incident with 4 or more gun homicide victims in a single incident. Most of those turn out not to be Newtown. Most of those turn out to be domestic violence, homicides, and murder-suicides, gang violence, drug market-related violence. They are not what I have been speaking about as spree shooting. And as people have tried to get on top of this, the best work has actually been done by policy shops and journalists who have tried to gather from public information what's going on here. But the basic empirical picture is really clear, which is it's a very, very small overall proportion of the way guns kill people in the United States. That doesn't mean it's not important, right? One could say the same thing about terror in the United States, right? Since 9/11, when nearly 3,000 people were killed in this city, if you take that and all the homicide caused by terrorists in the United States by all descriptions, that is also a very, very small proportion of the nation's homicide toll. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter, right? Terror is terrifying. Spree shootings are terrifying. So that's real, and we should give it the weight it deserves. It's also true that 99+% of people killed with guns in the United States are not killed in those kinds of events. Those events are concentrated in black neighborhoods across the United States. They are concentrated in black neighborhoods that are historically and presently damaged. They have been oppressed, they have been neglected, they have been subjected to historical racism. They have had imposed on them and suffer from all of the sort of root cause issues that we all know. They have frequently terrible schools, they have high dropout rates, they have high unemployment rates, people have family issues, there's bad health care, there is governmental neglect, there is worse than governmental neglect. And where we have high levels of concentrated gun violence in the United States, it is in those neighborhoods. In those neighborhoods, young black men are at fantastic risk. So the national homicide rate, as criminologists and the FBI measure this now, despite local and recent increases, that's been coming down quite steadily for over 20 years now. The national homicide rate is now between 4 and 5 per 100,000 nationally. In these neighborhoods, it is easy for the homicide rate among young black men to hit 150 per 100,000. Gun homicide is not evenly distributed socially, even within these communities. And as we look at what we know about gun violence, one of the most important things that has been learned in the last decades is that this image that we've had of dangerous communities is in a very fundamental empirical way not correct. So I talked about these communities a moment ago as we tend to, right? They are communities, they've suffered terrible historical harm and neglect. They have high levels of risk factors. We tend to talk about these communities this way. We tend to then act implicitly or explicitly as if everybody in them or all of the young men in them are at risk. This turns out to be empirically absolutely not right. Because what we know now is that within these communities, there are very, very small networks of folks who are at extremely high risk. I said 4 and 5 per 100,000, that's the national rate. Something on the order of 150 per 100,000 can be the young black male rate. Within these communities, there turn out to be networks of a few % of the community. And if you are a young man in one of these networks, your risk can go easily up to 500 and 600 per 100,000 every single year. And those are the gun homicide risks. We have, unfortunately, a lot of non-fatal woundings for every actual homicide. And it's easy for the young men in these high-risk networks to end up with gun violence victimization rates that are as high as 3,000 per 100,000 every single year. So 1 in 30 or so of the always young men in these networks get killed or shot every single year. Our colleague Andrew Papakistos, who's a sociologist at Yale, who's done a lot of this on-the-ground research, has done the math, and it shows that young men in these networks would be safer as serving military on the ground in Afghanistan than they are walking around in their own neighborhoods doing what they're doing right now. When we discuss facts like this, and I invite all of you to do what I do, which is when you see these accounts in the press and in the public conversation, watch what's about to happen. Because Andrew's research, a lot of the rest of the research on this, is about the victimization risk of young men in these communities, certain young men in these communities. It's a victimization risk. The conversation the presentation so far has been about people getting hurt. And every single article that I've read about Andrew's work, by the end of the newspaper story, we are talking about high-rate offenders. The research is about victimization. And probably the most important thing that we can understand about these high-risk networks is that they are folks who are at extraordinary risk of being hurt. And what we now know is a couple of different things. We know that that's real. We know that being at that kind of risk can drive instantly rational, but in the long term, very damaging behavior. These are young men who join groups and gangs for self-protection. They get weapons and carry guns for self-protection. If you sit any one of them down and say, why are you carrying a gun? Overwhelmingly what they say is, I'm scared, they're trying to hurt me, and that's objectively correct. If you go talk to them, they say the same thing, right? So it's not that this is legal or moral, but it is, in a way, deeply rational. We know that the rest of us have utterly failed to keep them safe. So one of the events in this series that was snowed out and that I hope we can bring back and put back on the schedule was a talk by Jill Leovy, who is a Los Angeles Times reporter who has written a brilliant book called Ghettoside. Ghettoside, there's one book I have been recommending to everybody who's interested in this issue, and Ghettoside is it. And it is a long, meticulous, and heartbreaking account of how violence in South Central Los Angeles is driven by the inability of the police to protect the community, the inability or the lack of performance of the police in solving homicides and shootings, the way that has broken any kind of confidence that the community has in the police to protect them, and how that drives folks into taking care of themselves, protecting themselves and their own, carrying guns, using guns, and how that drives a cycle of retaliation and even vendetta, which is what we see on the ground in these neighborhoods. So all of that we know to be true. And we also know, as a matter of logic and policy analysis, that the things we talk about in addressing gun violence, right, the menu of items that I went through as part of the current political and policy discourse, has very little prospective impact on that violence. These are not exotic military weapons. They're mostly not weapons with exotic big magazines. They're not folks who are suffering from mental illness. It's not stuff that is essentially impossible to understand and predict. Most of the weapons and the way that these weapons move to the street is illegal already. It is forbidden under current statute. And what turns out to be true is that most of what the country has been talking about in terms of gun violence prevention and gun control has very little connection to this issue, which is driven by, again, a small number of extreme folks. They tend already to be involved in the criminal street. These are absolutely ordinary, everyday weapons, and what's going on is not sparked by peculiar patterns of mental illness or, sociopathy. It's driven by community dynamics that are horrific, but we actually understand pretty well. Everybody really depressed now? I said, actually, a whole lot of progress has been made on that, and that's correct, right? So on this one, there is work that we really can do. And what's turned out to be true is that the groups and networks that drive this kind of violence are identifiable, not for the most part through fancy data analysis, but by working directly with frontline law enforcement and community people, the gangs and groups and drug crews and such that are at the heart of this violence are not operating undercover. They are flagrant and they stand out in the community. There really aren't that many of them. So the consistent finding across cities is that if you identify everybody involved in all of this, it's typically less than 0.5% of the population of the city. It's a very, very small group. And it's turned out that one can engage that group in a very particular and effective way. So police and other arms of law enforcement can get together, people who can provide social services can get together, people who represent community norms and standards can get together. And that new partnership of law enforcement, what we call the moral voice of the community, and folks who can provide outreach and support, can directly engage with these groups and with these young men. They can say in the voice of the community, we care desperately about you, we don't want you dead, we don't want you in jail, but the community absolutely rejects a few of the things that you are doing, and your own community insists that this stop. These are young men who we often say they have no respect. That's not true. They just don't respect the cops. They don't respect the outsiders. They don't respect a lot of people. They do respect a lot of people in their own community. And the folks who turn out to have the most power to engage with them are especially the surviving mothers who have lost their own sons, who have incredible moral power, the older, wiser, original gangsters who these guys looked up to, who have made their own way to a different place and can engage with them in very effective ways. The right kind of faith leaders, the right kind of community elders, but the capacity of communities to say this is the way we want to live and the way we don't want to live is truly profound. The partnership can offer them a way out. And the traditional thinking about this was everybody needs a job. That's clearly not the case. The opposite of shooting is not working. The opposite of shooting is not shooting. And it turns out, and we've learned this the hard way, but when one is talking about the very small number of most extreme folks in these settings, they have people who are trying to hurt them, and they need protection from that. They are saturated in pain and trauma. They have clinical levels of PTSD. They need trauma-informed care. They need help putting food on the table so they don't go to the corner and do crime because their younger brothers and sisters are hungry. They're afraid of their mother losing their roof. They need lots and lots and lots of very immediate things. And Paul Smith from my office is with us. They regularly experience violent acts, and they need a lot of help, and their families need a lot of help with immediate recovery from those events, which Paul has been part of inventing and taking national. So our kind of middle-class idea of what they need to turn their lives around has not been very accurate. But if we do what we say we want to do and meet them where they are, we can really help them. And law enforcement can say ahead of time, we want you to take this help. We want you to listen to other people. We want you to do what your community wants. We have not been protecting you. We have not been keeping you safe. But we are going to protect you. This violence is group-on-group violence. It's retaliatory. It's vendetta. You know it. We know it. And we're telling you ahead of time that gun violence will bring focused law enforcement attention to any and all crimes your group may be committing. And the price for a shooting may be, for example, that we look at all of your drug dealing, and the price to the group will be that everybody suffers a consequence for these other crimes. And what turns out to happen, at least on a good day, which is frequently, when the group understands there will be a group response to the violence, it polices itself. These group norms can be reversed. And one does this right, one can have a substantial impact on this kind of core gun crime. So let me wind up with this story, which is that a friend of ours is with the PICO National Network, which is I think the largest national faith-based community organizing network. They have put their full power behind this approach. They call it Alive and Free. And one of our colleagues there, a guy named Mike McBride, Pastor Mike McBride from Oakland, California, was brought into the White House when the Biden task force took up gun violence and gun control in the last administration. This has become a public story. It was written about by The Guardian, I believe, Lois Beckett, very good journalist working on these issues currently. And what happened was Mike, who understands all this, Pastor Mike, very, very clearly, said to the White House Policy Task Force, fine, pursue all this other stuff that is inspired by, in this case, Newtown. That's important, but that's not what's getting my people killed. My people are getting killed by this other stuff, and we know what to do about that, and I want your attention to this issue. And the White House policy people said, we don't think there's any political interest in that problem, and he got no effective response. So that's not right. Where people are living like this and we know something meaningful to do about it, we should be doing it. We do, in fact, know how to make a big difference. For the most part, we have not been taking that seriously. And as long as that's true, the National Network will continue to do our best. Thomas Abt.
My 20 minutes is to talk about what the evidence tells us about how best to reduce violence in urban America. And I want to be clear. We talk a lot about what we know, and that's a vast oversimplification. What I'm going to be talking about is really about what the best evidence and data tells us right now. But before I do that, I want to introduce a metaphor to sort of give you what I think is sort of the proper posture, the proper attitude about this type of about this problem and about this type of work. So, I want you to imagine that you're working the midnight shift in an emergency room, and you're an emergency room doctor. It could be in Lincoln Hospital up in the Bronx. Could be in any ER in any hospital in urban America. So let's say it's 2 a.m. and a new patient is admitted. He's wheeled in on a gurney. It's a young African-American man, and he's been shot. He's been shot in the leg, and the bullet has clipped his femoral artery. That is the largest artery in the body, and if you're familiar with these type of injuries, you know that they can be fatal within minutes because the blood loss is so rapid. And so the question to you, the attending physician, is what do you do about this young man? And maybe more precisely, what do you do right now? So you take a look at him. You take a look at his clothes, you look at his hands, you look at his face, and it's clear that this young man has already gone through a lot. And it's clear that he, like many others like him, has probably been disenfranchised, disadvantaged, discriminated against. He probably doesn't have a job. Maybe he doesn't have adequate housing. Maybe he didn't complete high school. So maybe that's the remedy. maybe what you do is you set them up with a mentor, or you find them a place to stay, or you buy them new clothes, or you get them a job. You look at him again, and you think to yourself, well, this young man has been shot. So obviously somebody wanted to hurt this guy. Maybe he's dangerous. So maybe, in fact, before doing anything else, I should call security. Maybe I should have him restrained. Maybe I should, make sure that the area is secure before I treat him. And what I want to suggest is that as the treating ER, you would do none of that, because you would do the only most obvious, most pressing, and most moral thing, which is, first, above all, you would stop the bleeding. Because if you didn't stop the bleeding, the kid would bleed out and he would be dead, and nothing else would matter. And so I want to suggest that that's really the sort of policy environment that we're in. So let's just go over the numbers really quickly. In 2015, the last year we have official data for, 37 people murdered a day, 13,500 murdered per year. That was an 11% increase from the year before. And it's looking like 2016, when the official numbers will come out, we'll have about the same level of increase. Nationally, 61% of murders are cleared, meaning that there's an arrest made. But in cities like Baltimore and Chicago, in cities where violent crime rates are high, the clearance rate is much, much lower. And unfortunately, they're much, much lower for African American victims. When you go to the CDC data, you see another pretty grievous disparity. If you look at, for all races ages to 15 to 25, homicide is the third leading cause of death. For whites, it's still the third leading cause of death. But for Latinos and Hispanics, it's the second leading cause of death. And for African Americans, it's the first leading cause of death. And it causes almost as many deaths as the 9 other leading causes of death combined. That is a huge disparity. Just thinking about the cost, 3 of the leading studies put the cost of a homicide at 9, 12, and 17 million per murder. That's all of the social costs. That's all of the legal costs, all of the medical costs, all of the lost opportunity costs of that person going on with their life and their employment. It's all of the willingness to pay costs that all the things that we're willing to do to avoid the risk of homicide, and all of those things, the indirect costs and the direct costs put together. If you multiply that by 13,500, you get this astronomical number of between 121 to 229 billion per year. And we all pay that. We all pay that through higher taxes, through higher health care premiums, through lower property values and lost economic opportunity. So you don't have to be one of those high-risk people to feel the impact of gun violence. But who's it hurting most? And David was talking about this. It turns out that some of the most rigorous research that's just come out says that it's poor kids who are being hurt most by violence. Obviously, this is besides the direct victims and their families. Raj Chetty and some of my colleagues at Harvard have done a landmark study on income mobility, looking at it nationally. And what they found is that lower rates of violent crime tend to produce better outcomes in terms of income mobility for kids. And so that was very important in a national study, that there is this association between crime and mobility. But it was just an association, and for all of the academics in the audience, and many of you, you all know that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. But that's where Pat Sharkey from NYU stepped in. And last year, he did a remarkable study using instrumental variables to get at this causal mechanism, what's actually happening under the hood. And what he found is that the evidence shows that violence may be a central mechanism by which kids are impacted by growing up in areas of concentrated disadvantage. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that violence keeps poor kids poor. And how does that happen? It happens by impacting their communities in terms of triggering depopulation, disinvestment, decreased property values, impacting government services, all types of things. And in the kids themselves, it impairs their cognitive development. They're hypervigilant. They can't relax. They can't focus. It disrupts their sleep. It leads to aggression. And later on in life, it leads to substance abuse, suicide, depression, obesity, and other forms of illness. Exposure to trauma and violence as a kid can give you a heart attack in your 50s. It can give you cancer in your 60s. And this has been proven by some remarkable studies called the Adverse Childhood Experience Studies, pioneered by Dr. Vince Folletti. So, sort of building on some of the questions that David was saying, what if we could slow this slaughter with policies that were already on the books today and with resources that wouldn't break the budget? And what if we could do it without massive expansions in arrests or incarceration or even governmental programs? And what if the single most important thing that you can do for poor kids is just doing the obvious thing, keeping them safe? So now let's get into the evidence. With a colleague of mine, Christopher Winship from the sociology department at Harvard, we launched this meta-review on violence reduction. And a meta-review is a review of reviews. We were trying to sort of survey the entire landscape of violence reduction in a relatively efficient way. So what that meant is we didn't look at individual studies. We looked at group studies that grouped all those together. And we did that in a rigorous way. We did that by first looking only at the most rigorous studies that had that produced evidence either through quasi-experimental or experimental designs, and then we only looked at the highest quality meta-reviews rated on this thing called an Amstar scale, which is a widely accepted scale for assessing quality. Essentially, what I want to say to you is that if there was a well-done study, and if it was reviewed in a systematic way, we looked at it. We found it, and we aggregated it into this report. And we aggregated over 1,400 individual studies, 43 eligible reviews, and found 30 discrete individual crime and violence reduction strategies. So what did we find out? Well, this builds on what David was talking about. We first found out that violence is sticky. It's not evenly distributed among people, places, or behavior. It concentrates among a small number of discrete micro-locations, high-impact offenders and victims, and certain key behaviors. As you can see, in Boston, 1% of the youth were responsible for over 50% of citywide shootings, and 5% of city blocks were responsible for 70% of total shootings. In Minneapolis, you see a very similar concentration, and then you see some broader data from Rob Muga from Igarape. And basically, what I'm trying to point out is that violence occurs at the intersection of these high-risk people, places, and behaviors. What does that look like on the street? What it looks like on the street is Friday night, you go to a nightclub where a bunch of different crews or cliques or gangs or whatever you want to call them they're all there. And they all have access to firearms. Maybe they have them on them, maybe more likely they're in somebody's glove compartment back in the car in the parking lot. And a dispute breaks out. And there's a fight, and everybody's drinking. That argument turns violent, that violence spills out, and somebody gets shot. What happens then is a cycle of retaliation. So back and forth between the groups that were involved that started in that club, but that can go on for weeks, months, years, decades. There are neighborhoods in Chicago, in Detroit, in Boston that are at war with each other. Nobody remembers what the original incident was. And that is the type of violence occurring between young men of color that is the that accounts for the plurality of lethal violence in the country today. So when I say plurality, it's the single largest group, accounts for more homicides than any other type of category. It's not the majority, but it is the plurality. So common sense dictates that, and the evidence shows that, not surprisingly, if violence is sticky, it's sticky strategies that seem to work best. And we see this again and again. The most effective policing strategies, the most effective gang strategies, the most effective reentry strategies, and on and on. They are all the most targeted and specific strategies. They're not overbroad, they're not overgeneralized. That's what we know in criminal justice. In public health, we often talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Primary is the most general prevention, secondary is a little bit more focused, and tertiary is highly focused. Well, in a systematic review, reviewing 15 randomized controlled trials, the most rigorous form of social science evidence, only 33% of the primary prevention interventions were effective, 43% for secondary, and 100% of the tertiary preventions were effective. And this is generally reinforced again and again and again. The more targeted you are, the more effective you are. It's true for prevention, it's true for intervention, it's true for enforcement, and it's true for reentry. Now, one of the sort of common refrains is, well, what if you focus on this hotspot? What if you focus on these high-impact offenders? Won't violence just move down the street? Or won't somebody just take that person's place? And the answer is not for serious violence. And in fact, 30 years of social science tells us that there's something about these locations and these peoples and behaviors that is sticky. Meaning crime doesn't just move down the corner, it doesn't just jump to the next person, and it doesn't apply equally to all behaviors. So I want to talk a little bit about not just the sort of overall analysis, but some of the standouts from the meta-review, the programs that really work best. And there were two. The first standout we've been talking about, focused deterrence, which is the strategy that's pioneered by David and the National Network for Safe Communities. Its key elements, as he said, I'll go through this very quickly, identify the specific offenders and offending groups that are responsible for the majority of the violence in that area, mobilize this multidisciplinary group, law enforcement, social service, community members, frame a response using both sanctions and rewards, that's important, and then direct repeated communication with them. In 2012, there was a systematic review of this strategy. 9 out of 10 evaluations covered in this systematic review showed substantial reductions in crime and violence, with homicide reductions ranging from 34 to 63%. Since that has been done, there have been additional individual studies, and those have also been increasing, supporting the effectiveness. There are other effective crime and violence reduction strategies out there, and I'll mention a few of them, but the effect size for focused deterrence, meaning the actual impact, is one of the largest out there. So it's an important one to keep in mind. The other one is on the prevention side of things, and that's cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT uses clinical psychology to alter distorted or problematic thinking and behavior. Things like being hypervigilant, things like having no future orientation. If you know some of these kids, they will tell you terrible things. They will tell you, I don't really expect to be here past 18, 19, 20. They have extremely limited future orientation. Hypervigilance means if they feel like they're threatened or confronted, they go from 0 to 60 super, super fast. And so CBT is not about, it's not about Freudian stuff. It's not about talking about mommy and daddy. It's about talking about, are there specific ways that you're thinking and that you're behaving that are getting you into trouble and that are not consistent with, you succeeding in the future. Some of the strengths of CBT are its flexibility and adaptability. Again, stickiness. It works best with the highest risk offenders, but it works with both kids and grown-ups. It's adaptable both behind the bars and in the community. It's useful as a standalone program, but it can be paired with other forms of prevention programming as well. And in fact, it's slightly more effective when it's paired with other forms of programming. And here you can see the evidence. 58 studies, including 19 RCTs, randomized controlled trials, the strongest form of social science evidence, show a relatively large 25% decrease in recidivism. But if you do it, when you implement it most effectively, you can get reductions of 52%. And actually, about 1/5 of the programs that were evaluated in this meta-review achieved that 50% reduction. So it's not an extreme outlier to get that type of reduction. And this confirms the findings of many other systematic reviews about CBT. I want to talk about some honorable mentions and some of the programs that don't work. So other programs that have promise, that have worked well, but maybe not as well as the two I just discussed, are hotspots policing, problem-oriented policing, and targeted firearms enforcement. Drug treatment, either in the community or through drug courts, has been shown to be been effective. Family-based primary and secondary prevention, things like the nurse-family partnership and family functional therapy. Reentry programming, but with a risk needs responsivity framework. That's a very specific thing, meaning that reentry programming that is devoted to the highest risk people, that is addressing their needs and responsive to those needs, is critical. That doesn't mean that all reentry programming works. It's a very specific framework. What doesn't work? Gun buybacks don't work. They're one of the most popular anti-violence strategies out there. They just don't work. If there's one thing I'd love to just get across is forget the gun buybacks. I know they make everybody feel good, but the kinds of guns that they get is they get these inoperable muskets from 400 years ago. These guns have no nexus to criminality whatsoever. So you got to get rid of this thing. And at this point, when I talk to mayors or police chiefs or people who do this, I say, look, maybe you feel you have to do this because you think it's great PR or something like that, but just recognize it's going to have no impact on your gun problem whatsoever. Aggressive drug enforcement. Interestingly, while aggressive enforcement on guns is effective, aggressive enforcement on drugs is not. And in fact, it can have a negative impact on violence by destabilizing the relationships between drug dealers and causing more competition and potentially violence. Interestingly, standalone job readiness and education programs have either mixed effectiveness or ineffectiveness. And this is where CBT comes in. One of the things that I think that the research is increasingly showing is if you're working with ex-offenders or people at very high risk for criminality or violence, simply throwing stuff at them, simply throwing housing, a job, education, all of these things, and not addressing their underlying criminogenic thinking, antisocial thinking, those underlying behaviors, very unlikely to succeed. So it doesn't mean that you don't do job programs. It doesn't mean that you don't do mentoring. It doesn't mean that you don't do education. But there has to be that CBT component. Another thing, famously, tough love strategies. Famously ineffective. Scared Straight, for instance, of the program, which is very popular, doesn't work. Not only does it not work, it increases recidivism among youth. Boot camps don't work. Curfews don't work. All of these sort of aggressive, tough love, show them you mean business things don't work with kids. So I just want to, and so, you know, one of the issues is how do you, sorry?
When you say curfews, are you referring to the entire community?
I'm talking about gang curfews. I want to talk a little bit about New York's Gang and Give initiative, which is the gun-involved violence elimination initiative. And it's something that I'm very proud to have had a hand in starting when I was the head of public safety, the deputy secretary for public safety here in New York State, serving under Governor Cuomo. It was launched in July 2014. There's an evaluation pending. The entire program, which goes over many counties and is puts out about anywhere between $10 to $15 million per year, has one goal and one goal only: stop shootings and stop killings. And it's focused on three key principles: identifying key people and places, promoting alignment among strategies, and improving engagement with impacted communities. It only uses evidence-informed approaches, and it brings people together across disciplines, both in local teams and across a broad statewide network. So we are seeing more programs that are, and not surprisingly, what are many of the GIVE localities making use of? Focused deterrence, the work that's been pioneered by David and his colleagues. So we are seeing reasons for hope and optimism. Increasing the constituency for these evidence-based programs is increasing. But we know what works, but why isn't it out there further? Why doesn't everybody know about focused deterrence? Why doesn't everybody know about CBT? And why doesn't everybody know that you have to have a balance between enforcement and prevention, and that you've got to focus on these things? Well, I'm really an expert in violence reduction. I'm not really an expert in politics, but I have been a political appointee for multiple administrations, so I'll give you some of my thoughts. These are not evidence-based. I see three major obstacles. The first is a preference for legal solutions over policy solutions. Generally speaking, our first thought when we see some type of social problem is, let's pass a law. But in fact, legal solutions, passing a law, is often an overbroad way, it's often very costly, and it's also often very hard to achieve politically. When there are more targeted, more affordable, and more practical ways through policy to address some of these social problems. That's not to say, and I support Ted's work with Everytown. We do need legal changes, and I am a firm believer in common sense approaches to gun regulation. However, too many times we view this as the whole story, and it's not the whole story. There's tremendous progress could be made with the laws exactly as they are right now. We shouldn't be satisfied with that, but we need to keep that in mind. And then, we're in a remarkable moment for criminal justice and criminal justice reform. And I think overall that's a good thing. But too often, this moment is sort of defined by absolutism on all sides, on extreme views. And we're forcing the public into a series of false choices about criminal justice. A choice between legitimacy and security. When in fact these two are of course closely interrelated. It's a choice. We'd say that you have to choose between Black Lives Matter and black on black crime. You have to choose between whether the injustice in the system is all about white racism or black criminality. You have to decide whether this is all about gun control or all about gun rights. And I would point out that and so so there are all these different sort of false dichotomies that we need to break down. And one of the things that I find most interesting is when you go to the actual communities that are most impacted, most burdened by both gun violence and by police misconduct and mass incarceration and all of these things, and you actually talk to people on the street, and when you look at the surveys that measure the attitudes and opinions of those people are far more practical and far less ideological than the rest of us, and far more focused on concrete changes than many of their supposed advocates. What they want is real relief, real help, real assistance right then. And then the last real obstacle is a looming one. And one of the sort of things that I worry about in this criminal justice debate is how we talk about race. Many people in this moment are obsessed with sort of racial hatred or racial animus as it's woven throughout the criminal justice system. And I don't want to suggest that it's not there. And I don't want to suggest that when it's there, it's not horrible. But I've been doing this for 2 decades, and I've been researching it for a long time. So I have a lot of personal, professional, academic experience with this. And I have to say that is not, in my view, the number one racial justice challenge. It's the apathy. It's not that, it's not the hatred of those people in charge that's really causing the most huge consequences for people in these disadvantaged, disenfranchised communities. It's the apathy. And I think that the real question is, what if this was happening? What if the leading cause of death was homicide for young white men? Would we feel the same way? Would we just say, hey, you know, what are we going to do? Would we be satisfied with this political impasse? Would we, or I suspect that we wouldn't. I suspect that we would have a much different, much more dramatic, much more robust response. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good evening. So I am here to talk to you guys today is about, you guys heard about the deterrence programs. You guys have been hearing about the great work David Kennedy and his staff have been doing. I'm here to tell you that it works. I'm here to share today with you guys the programs that we're doing up in the city of Newburgh. Not sure if a lot of you guys know about Newburgh. We're about 60 miles north up from here, population 29,000 folks, 4 square miles. And we're starting to see the problems that the big cities have. Sad to say, this program started, I started part of this program 3 years ago. I come from a decade in law enforcement, and I have to tell you that coming from law enforcement to doing this work as the GIVE project manager has been an eye-opener. Being a police officer, you're going into these calls, you're going from job to job to job, you're seeing people at their worst, you're not having conversations with them. You're basically there to get a report, get the job done, and get to the next one. And no fault of a police officer, it's just part of the job. Having this part of the, being on this side now has been a little different because I have been able to empathize with a lot of folks, sitting down with them when they're at their worst, celebrating when they're at their best, and following that through. And it's been an eye-opener also to see that a lot of the gang violence that we're experiencing in Newburgh is coming from our young adults, our young black males. David Kennedy said earlier, the problems are, the young men are feeling they're not getting enough attention. Either they are in despair, they're living in horrible situations. A lot of the young men that we're coming across are having these issues. Social media, let's go to social media. How many times has social media, I feel sometimes is ruining our kids. A lot of times you're seeing a lot of these guys that we come across, we ask them, why is the problem when we sit down with these guys? What is this beef about? I don't know. He posted something on social media, I didn't like it, so therefore we had to go to his block and take care of it. And it's just a cycle that's happening over and over again. You guys heard about the GVI program. When we have these call-ins, we're bringing in guys that are part of a group, again, the small groups that are causing the violence in the community. And when we have these guys in the room, after the call-ins, we usually follow up with them. And my question to them is always, how did you feel about this call-in? What did you think? A lot of them sit back and say, you know what? I didn't see things the way that you guys are bringing them up. I didn't think about that. I don't even know why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. I have come out of prison. Put yourself in my shoes. I don't have a job. I don't have an education. My family's in despair. We don't have money. What am I supposed to do? Nobody wants to hire me is something that we often hear. And it makes me sad sometimes because you think about there is choices. We have a lot of programs that a lot of people are not aware of. So bringing that awareness to them is something that we don't take lightly. We have got some great partnerships with the Catholic Charities, different folks in the city of Newburgh. Again, Newburgh is not a big place, so the resources are all in one building. Getting folks, holding folks accountable that are saying they want to do this work has been something that I specifically take very seriously. If I'm going to have someone help somebody, we're going to come to somebody sometimes, like Mr. Thomas said, they may not ready for work. Everything is not work. You have some folks that come out and mental health is not, they're not there. They just had so much trauma. and their mental health is not in a place where they need to go, and now we're saying you need to find a job, and then we're wondering why are they getting a job and then tomorrow they leave that job and they're not succeeding at these jobs. So getting to the root of the problem, I think, is very important and something that we need to stress when we're doing this work. A lot of times, our culture is very much afraid of getting mental health. When you bring up that word, it's like taboo for a lot of us. And sitting down with folks, and again, going back to what I was saying earlier, where I get to now sit down with folks and kind of digest, the issues. Asking someone, I've learned, is sitting back and listening is a skill that I had to really master, especially for what I'm doing now. When you tell someone that is in feeling in this, just feeling kind of, lost, no hope, I'm living in this poverty, look at where I'm living, miss, what am I supposed to do? And when you sit down with them and kind of analyze and kind of giving them steps of where they take that, and some of the guys call you back to say thank you. Thank you for taking the time out. Even if they get a job, they'll call you to say, you know what, I got a job, and it's a sense of pride for them. Where oftentimes they're feeling that folks are coming in, social workers are coming into their house, and they're not really listening. They're telling them what they need, but they're not asking them where they're at now. So meeting folks where they're at has been very, very important in this work. Asking them, getting their input. A lot of times, a lot of the families, we do something called custom notifications, where if there has been a shooting, we just had a homicide last week. The brother of the victim, has been very upset, posting stuff on social media. We got the police department on it. We went over to talk to mom. He wasn't there. We took a letter to mom, just a letter that we give them, just letting them know that we want them safe, alive, and out of prison is a message that we give them, and that there is help in the community. Sitting down with mom, when we first got there, mom was just a little nervous. Took her time. She invited us in. We sat down with her. We spent 45 minutes with mom just going down, what happened. It really broke my heart to hear mom grasp onto the letter that I gave her, and for her to cry over this letter and tell me, where was this program when my son needed help? And us telling her, I am sorry that we didn't get to your son on time was something that so small, but it was so big to her. Sitting there with her and couldn't help but to notice bullet holes in her living room. Well, her son is part of one of the gangs on the other side of town. They're constantly coming over, and mom's question is, why is the police always not there when we need them, constantly picking on the community? We're not doing their part, but yet I have to come home. I've been working 19 years, making an honest living, and here I am in my home, and I have to call my son in the middle of the night to come help me, to come inside the house because I'm afraid that someone is out there waiting to get him. Just listening to mom saying these things, this is just many of the stories that we hear when we go and do these custom notifications. They invite you, the families invite you in, and you hear it time and time and time again. What's going on? You're attacking us. The community feels as if there is no hope. What we started to notice was now this transparency of going over, sitting down with the family and letting them know, this is what's happening, we know what you're doing, we're asking you to stop, there's a help. So offering the help and really following through when you're offering help. Really holding people accountable, especially the folks in our communities that are working and getting these grants to help out. That has become one of the biggest things in Newburgh. The conversation has shifted. We have brought partners to the tables where now we have probation, parole. It's important to have these partners at the table, specifically when you're speaking of folks that are either just getting out of probation and you're trying to help them out. Sometimes they feel probation is trying to violate me. How can I get the help? I'm getting attacked in every which way, but there's no way that I'm going to get out of this. So when you let them know, oh, I know your probation officer. Let's have a conversation with your probation officer. And going into the office and having that conversation while that probation officer is there and rationalizing, saying, okay, this is the expectations. This is how we're going to help you. You start to see a shift. You start to see a huge shift in the way that these guys are doing things. We have had a call-in starting in October. We have had 4 call-ins, about 58 gentlemen. I think the rate right now, out of the 58, I think 7% of those guys have reoffended and have been for minor crimes. Hasn't been any gun crime. It has been low-level crimes. So I think when we say that focus deterrence does work. In a small town like ours, I know Mr. Kennedy said earlier, it was a little shocking that it was going to work because we're such a small place. But I think with the accountability, with the police department taking in ownership, and all the partners that we have at the table, the federal government, everybody just taking ownership and having these conversations where we have our weekly meetings and we're talking about the things that are going on and acting on these things as they're happening has definitely began to shift in our community. Another thing that I wanted to bring back with Mr. Thomas was mentioning earlier, the young adults. We also run a program with the youth and the police. And at these programs, time and time again, you hear the kids say, "Why are you killing us?" And that is a question that has been at every single youth and police program that we have done. And having the police officers sit there and kind of have that dialogue with the kids has been tremendously helpful, not only for the kids, but for the police department in the city of Newburgh. It has been now, every new police officer in the city of Newburgh has to go through this program. It's the kids getting to know their officers and their officers getting to know the kids in the community. So I think that, starting them early and having that conversation might prevent us from having this young man come in front of us in a call-in or preventing further crime in the city of Newburgh. I think that, we have had a wonderful success with having the staff here guide us. We've been working with them diligently, just trying to think outside of the box in the way that we can help our community and the folks in our community, especially the guys that are creating this violence. And again, it's a very small percentage in the city of Newburgh of the folks that are committing the violence. Just recently there was a sweep, and you had to see the community coming out and say, we can finally sit out in front of our porch. We can finally have our kids outside. Thank you. And just thanking the police officers for taking these guys because they knew that those guys were responsible for most of the violence. So I am not going to take up any more of your time. I thank you guys for having me and for listening. I'm going to have Mr. Alcorn come up.
All right, well, it's a big responsibility to wrap up a panel with these practitioners. And I'm really grateful to David and for inviting us, and to John Jay. And I was thinking we've sort of progressively zoomed in the course of these conversations, understanding gun violence in the United States, looking at the evidence of what works, hearing what this intervention specifically looks like and the challenges in implementing it in a given situation. And I think it's probably appropriate to my role to zoom back out a little bit and to think a little bit more about what got us here and about what we do about it. Because I think, as Thomas actually alluded to, there has been a couple of deficits that have allowed gun violence to exist in the extraordinary rates that we have in the United States. For a long time, as David mentioned, we didn't know how to address it. But we also do have this political problem. We have shown a societal inability to address violence, and to address it will require a societal response, because this is something that, it turns out, groups, and in fact our whole nation is implicated in certain ways. And I think that speaks, in fact, to what Everytown as an organization does, which we sit at the nexus of the evidence about what works, policymakers who are trying to work through our institutions to make change, mayors who are trying to institute programs in their cities to address gun violence and in other types of communities, and then, of course, the American people. And so I want to introduce a little bit about Everytown and then talk a little bit about how the work that we do, I think, maybe wraps around some of the conversation that we're having here about gun violence specifically in cities. So Everytown is, as David said, a large national gun violence prevention advocacy and research organization. And we're really about trying to put into practice in society the ideas that have emerged and that are being tested and implemented around the country, and to drive this sort of political change. We were founded in 2006 by a group of mayors originally, including the mayor of this city, Mayor Michael Bloomberg. But our organization has grown in both scale and in dimension, and now we consider ourselves to represent about 1,000 current and former mayors who are part of our organization, so a community of survivors of gun violence that now numbers in the thousands, who are a part of our survivor network. And most importantly, about 3 million Americans who have signed up online to be a part of our organization, or the over 50,000 folks who are working in chapters around our country offline to try and raise the awareness about gun violence and drive political change in their communities to address it. And I would obviously invite all of you to consider looking at everytown.org and looking into maybe participating in some of the events and the work that we're doing here in New York City and New York State. And I think when I think about what we've been discussing here today, gun violence specifically in where it's most atrocious, at its most atrocious rates, we as an organization pull back a little bit and try and look at gun safety clearly as in the larger context. Certainly there are about 35 people murdered with firearms every day, but it may come as a surprise, about 60 people die by their own hand with a gun suicide every day as well. So gun homicide makes up a part of the portrait of gun injury and death in the country. Additionally, gun violence in cities is much higher, is about twice as high in our largest cities as it is elsewhere in the country. But in the top 25, and so in the top 25 cities in the US, you have about 1 in 5 gun homicides that's occurring nationwide is occurring there. But 4 of 5 gun homicides are occurring in other communities, suburban, rural communities around our country as well. And so confronted with the vastness of this problem, I think Everytown really seeks to address these sorts of changes in a number of ways. Foremost, I think we're most known for working on legislative changes to think about how we address this sort of violence through law. And as has been mentioned, there's a lot of difficulty in passing laws, but on the other hand, laws are durable. They make changes over time. And certainly as we see these effective kind of policies and programs emerge, and they need to be supported in cities, but we also recognize that bureaucrats turn over, resources cease to exist, certainly the political environment changes, and cities that have effectively implemented violence reduction strategies have also let them go. So we have to think about not only how we can support those programs, but also how we can create an environment in which they are sustained and which there is the knowledge and the wherewithal to do that. So some of the, and I think also I want to say that it's implicit in everything that we've been talking about how central guns are to this conversation, but I'm going to emphasize we're here talking about gun violence for a reason, because firearms are the key to understanding why gun violence in the United States occurs at rates that are just so extraordinary compared to other countries. When you look at the rates of homicide that we experience, it's about 25 times higher than other nations when you put a basket of countries together. And it's not because we have more crime. It's not because Americans are fundamentally different in ways from those countries, although there are plenty of differences. The key factor is that crime and violence in the United States is uniquely lethal, because it occurs very often with firearms, and firearms are far more lethal than other kinds of weapons and implements in which those disputes can occur. And so when we are thinking about violence in cities, we're thinking about risk and how to address some of the factors that have been discussed here today, but we're also thinking about how to change the environment in which the criminogenic kind of behavior we're talking about occurs. And we know that we have a country with a huge availability of firearms. Why are so many firearms ending up in cities, in black markets of cities where they are available and become implicated in some of the behaviors that we're talking about? And so our legal work focuses on the policy areas where there's the strongest evidence that we can make a difference on access to firearms in those kind of at-risk situations. Foremost, we are making efforts across the country to strengthen the background check system. This is basically the system that has been in existence since the early 1990s to identify through previous behavior folks who are too dangerous to have firearms because of previous offending, because of domestic violence history, other factors. And then at the point of sale, if they try to buy a gun at a licensed gun dealer, to reject those sales. We have a federal requirement that gun dealers conduct background checks on every buyer, but we have exempt what turns out to be a huge share of sales, those sales by unlicensed sellers, so non-licensed sellers who want to resell a firearm, whether it's at a gun show, online, et cetera. And the most recent research looks like about 20% of transfers of firearms in the United States actually occur without a background check. That's the most recent research on this. And there are reasons to think that whereas every firearm originally is sold with a background check by that licensed dealer, in their lifetime, many of those firearms, of course, end up in the hands of unlawful possessors. We have about 350,000 firearms that are recovered by police departments and submitted to the ATF for tracing each year. And our question is, how can we reduce the seepage from the lawful folks who have purchased firearms originally to this endpoint? Far too often, cities where they're being implicated in the high rates of violence that we're seeing. So we've had some natural experiments, some good, some bad, around background check laws at the state level. In Missouri, which unfortunately in 2007 repealed its background check requirement, it went from a system where every gun buyer had to show a permit before buying a firearm, regardless of where they bought it, to show that they were allowed to have it, to a system where that was no longer the case. And the best research coming out of Johns Hopkins shows that gun homicides in Missouri increased about 25% afterwards and have been sustained at that level ever since. Fortunately, a lot of the natural experiments that we've seen in the policy environment since the Newtown shooting have been the opposite direction. We've seen about 7 states have strengthened or expanded their background check requirement to cover all gun sales. And while it's too soon to see a lot of research out of these places, they are gun-owning states like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, most recently Nevada. So there's a lot of, actually a ton of movement at the state level which had not been occurring before. And we are hopeful that states will continue to pass those laws, and ultimately Congress will require a background check for every gun sale. We also work a lot on the legal environment around domestic violence and firearms. While women are less likely to be victimized in a homicide than are young men, about half of the murders of women in the United States, period, are with firearms, and about half of the murders are domestic violence. They're by an intimate partner or family member. So this is a huge aspect of violence against women is occurring with firearms and in a domestic violence setting. And as it turns out, again, there's pretty good evidence that when states strengthen the laws that they have around keeping abusers from having firearms and from turning the firearms in that they already have, you see reductions in homicides, in intimate partner violence, 10 to 15% range. So again, it's not the whole picture, but there are significant reductions based on the impact of those state laws. And we've seen a lot of progress around domestic violence, where about 23 states have passed a domestic violence law related to strengthening prohibitors for abusers or ensuring that they turn in firearms that they already have. And then we do also fight against what I would describe as sort of the guns everywhere agenda of groups, probably most famously the NRA, but other types of groups who I would say, despite their stated mission, work primarily to deconstruct the existing safeguards and norms that we have as a society around firearm ownership, firearm-related behaviors. And I would actually make the argument that there's reasons to think that this has implications for gun violence wherever it occurs. Because whereas violence in the end is very concentrated, both geographically, spatially, and socially, as we're talking about in these networks, in disadvantaged neighborhoods and cities, and very too often among communities of color, the firearms that are coming there are coming from all around the country. You may be surprised to know that 9 out of 10 firearms recovered in New York City crime scenes was sold outside of the state. And the biggest source of firearms in New York City is not New York State, it's Virginia, and Georgia. So the weak gun laws in other parts of the country actually put you at risk no matter where you are and no matter how strong the gun laws are in your state. And so when we're working to address the NRA's deconstruction of concealed carry permit laws, it may very well have implications for how many folks are storing firearms in their cars where they are pilfered by the tens of thousands each year, guns that are stolen because of changes in behavior and how people are owning firearms elsewhere that are pumping more firearms into the illegal market and changing the availability of firearms in cities elsewhere. when we were trying to prevent the NRA from passing stand your ground laws, these are laws that started in Florida and essentially turned the courts of justice in reverse and said that if you have a justifiable reason to think that you are in danger, you can use lethal force against someone outside of your own home. Most famously, the death of Trayvon Martin, where George Zimmerman sought protection under this. That has implications for how gun owners around the country behave in circumstances where you can have catastrophic consequences, and consequences that fall, again, disproportionately on communities of color. I want to raise just a couple of other areas that we're working in, I think, and to think about what Everytown does, and then turn it back to Q&A with the rest of the panel, because I'm very curious for that conversation. But I will say that another area that we are really cognizant of is how to motivate cities and law enforcement and communities to be able to act on the best evidence with the sufficient resources for their own behest. I was pulling up, we put together a report on strategies for reducing gun violence in cities. A few of these panelists actually were gracious enough to give us some feedback on it and some comments throughout the production of it, and it features, I think, many, if not all, of the evidence and the studies and the interventions that were described today, along with some others that cities are using to address violence. And we like to think of it as kind of a source book for mayors who may be coming into office new and not really appreciating all of the policy levers at their disposal and the benefits of addressing violence head on. We also foster, to the extent that we can, scientific research, because these interventions do not occur in a vacuum. They occurred in academic institutions and in law enforcement agencies and in communities because there were people there thinking about them and willing to spend some time and care and put some effort into it. And so when we are working in Capitol Hill, usually, hopefully under more favorable circumstances, but we are always advocating for a return to research and investment in the study of gun violence as a public health issue. And famously, the CDC has been under a sort of informal ban on gun violence research since 1996, and we have been, I think, at the forefront of trying to advocate that Congress appropriate funding, again, to study gun violence, that ATF be allowed to do the kinds of analyses of recovered crime guns so that they can inform law enforcement agencies around the country about where their guns are coming from, and that the NIJ and other agencies that have continued to fund research and continue to up and support that. And we have even gone to the extent of funding research ourselves by supporting folks like the Urban Institute, which has been in the process of and will be putting out a really terrific piece of research that was presented at the American Society of Criminology. I point to David because I know he was there. We were both seeing the presentation, showing the consequences of gun violence in cities for the economic health of the neighborhoods as a whole. They're actually showing that surges in gunfire, which of course are affecting the people who are being penetrated by those bullets, but have consequences for business growth and for housing values that are extremely consequential and ought to motivate the business community and cities to think about how to invest in addressing this violence. It could be cost neutral in many cases, probably, given the potential benefits for the community as a whole. And then I'll finish by saying that I've been thinking a lot about the bigger culture and gun culture, I guess I would say, and what implications it has for all of this. Because in the gun violence prevention space, I think the words gun culture have been, for a long time, applied to the beliefs and behaviors and language that gun owners may use, people who identify with and use firearms regularly. And I think the gun violence prevention movement has deliberately sort of poised itself as something different, calling itself the gun control movement for a long time. We now talk about ourselves as the gun violence prevention movement. We kind of seeded the terminology gun culture. And I actually think that that is something we should not cede. Because culture in America around guns is something that we all create, whether or not you own a firearm or live with a person with a firearm or just vote on issues around firearms or vote for officials that are going to have to make decisions about policies that have to do with firearms. But because all of that, I think, adds up to gun culture. And I think it's Everytown's sort of implicit belief that while we need the evidence to invest in addressing these issues, while we rightly need to go address the guy who's bleeding out because of the femoral artery and start with the highest priority folks, and we know that every day there are more deaths, we also need to address our fundamental attitudes and behaviors and beliefs towards firearms as a whole. Because, as I said, I think it has implications for how firearms are arriving in city streets, and it has to do with how they were stored when they were originally bought, how they were transferred in their last transfer, whether there was a background check. It has implications for firearm violence that we didn't really talk about today, but about suicides and about the many people who live in a household with firearms and are at a higher risk of suicide as a result, and whose family members may not have the tools or the language or the understanding to step in when it's critical that they do so and make sure that that firearm is stored securely or stored somewhere else. And it has consequences in the end for elections and for votes and for how states and cities end up choosing the leaders that are going to make these policies. And for too long, we have not had a strong enough coherence, I guess, as a society to a gun culture that would allow us to have a Second Amendment and to have a fair number of, about 50 million people in the United States right now live in households with firearms, but would also allow us to have, to reduce the intolerable rates of gun violence that are occurring across the country. And the first way that we're doing this is June 2nd is Gun Violence Awareness Day. This is something that is not Everytown's idea. It came from a group of young people in Chicago who were friends with a young woman named Hadia Pendleton, a young woman who performed in Barack Obama's second inaugural parade and who weeks later was shot and killed in her neighborhood. And her friends started to wear orange to school. They said it was the color of hunters, and the mere indication it was just to say, we're here. You know, don't shoot us. And to show the world that gun violence was something that had impacted them and was important to them. And since then, each year when we've had this, helped foster this awareness day, it's grown vastly and vastly. And it's a first way to give all the people who presumably care about gun violence but don't have a way to talk about it a voice and a way to externalize it and to show it to other people. And so, you know, we're really looking forward to that in this coming year. And I guess I'll just say that in the end, I'm very optimistic in the end, although, as I've said, there's been a lot of progress at the state level in terms of the legislation that's available, and what we know about it has improved so much. And I think, frankly, this panel maybe is part of the evidence of that, the fact that we're talking about this here in New York, even though this city has experienced overall large reductions in gun violence, and the diversity of the folks that are on this panel in their viewpoint and the way they're addressing this problem. Because in the end, a healthy movement, which I consider us all members of, has folks who are experts in different areas of addressing this problem, but who are talking about it and finding ways to test each other's assumptions and hopefully finding good ways to collaborate. So thank you very much for the time.
Thanks, Ted, and Thomas, and Isabel. So over to you, and I'm going to move a mic around for anybody who wants it. Let me take the prerogative of the moderator to say brief questions, brief comments, and anything that goes beyond that, I warn you, I will intervene. So you're first.
So an often thing with inter-partner violence is very often the boy. If you guys already know what it is, it would save time. The boyfriend loop, where often if they were never married to the victim, or were dating them, or if they were just a spurred suitor, they can still get through background checks. And how would we go about closing that? Because it's still a huge problem that faces women every day.
Yeah, I am happy to answer that. That's a great point. And due to changes in the characteristics, I think, of intimate partner violence, it sounds like you know probably as much or more than I do about this, but the the characteristics of intimate partner gun homicides have been shifting over the last 30 years, and whereas previously the majority of intimate partner gun homicides of women were perpetrated by people who were married to or had children with or were common law partners of those women. Nowadays, actually, it's flipped to the opposite. A majority of intimate partner violence is occurring in a dating relationship. And under federal law, again, we have this sort of prohibitor that is to designate, and it was created as part of, in the 1990s when there was a real emergence of an understanding of domestic violence being a huge, huge problem, and one that had been really under-addressed due to the misogyny, basically, of our society. But created a special prohibitor saying not only if you've committed a felony, you're not going to be able to purchase a firearm, but actually if you committed even a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, or if you're under domestic violence restraining order, you will not be able to purchase a firearm. But to define that intimate partner relationship, it had to be in the what is called similarly situated as a spouse. And so some solutions have been offered of how to capture this with our sort of risk targeting, this larger group of potentially risky folks. And I want to say Senator Klobuchar has been kind of one of the lead federal sponsors of legislation to just basically change the federal definition to be more expansive and to capture intimate partners. And I believe a number of states have actually done this, and so there's ways of designating a larger group of folks as prohibited. And I mean, there's other ways to address intimate partner violence as well. I don't know if David wants to talk about a High Point project that he's been involved in, but I think, we need to think about how to tackle this from multiple angles.
Hi. So my background's a little bit in like neurocriminology, and so, with this new administration, I'm sorry, I have a little soft voice. So my I'm sorry? Okay. So the House, I think, just voted to overturn Obama's rules on selling guns to the severely mentally ill, and I think now it's going to the Senate. How do you guys see that affecting some of your work, and maybe especially what you were saying on spree killings and just the regular, I guess, gun sales and the effect of gun violence in neighborhoods?
So let me invite Ted again to start off on that, and then Thomas, you want in?
Sure. So in brief, the current administration, I think, has spoken pretty directly to Americans about their views towards gun violence and towards gun violence prevention policy. And I think it's involved a heavy dose of one of the problematic things that Thomas identified, which was this sort of absolutism. And they're, given the folks that have been nominated to important positions in the Department of Justice and elsewhere, there's a lot of really martial rhetoric around crime and punishment. At the same time, the NRA was the lead independent sponsor of the Trump administration. They put about $30 million into campaign, and they've been making a good show of trying to flex what they see as their political muscles afterwards. And so there have been a number of actions, executive actions taken in the first 60 days, which you allude to one of them. And I would say one was to rescind an Obama-era regulation that had ensured the Social Security Administration was fulfilling its obligation as a federal agency to submit relevant records that they believe met the regulations requirement of folks who had for information the Social Security Administration had met the mental illness requirements, so they should not be allowed to purchase firearms. And then the House, which you just alluded to, has recently passed a bill onto the Senate that would also throw out all the records that the Veterans Administration has submitted, again, of veterans who were deemed mentally, who were not deemed mentally fit to own firearms. I think its future is unclear. Everytown opposes these repeals absolutely. Now, I would say mental illness and gun violence really overlap in the most narrow sense, and I think that's what David was referring to earlier. Mental illness, diagnosed mental illness being implicated even in only maybe 4% of crime is what we see in sort of international studies. far more likely if you have a diagnosed mental illness to be a victim of a crime than to perpetrate one. And I think if anything, our concern about the elimination of these safeguards is for folks who may be among those named in those records who now may be able to access firearms and who would then therefore be at a much higher risk of suicide, of self-harm with the firearm afterwards. So I don't think it would have, I would say even in our surveys of sort of school shootings and the mass public shootings that David was speaking about earlier, mental illness in a diagnosed sense really does not figure in more than 10% of them, and I wouldn't expect it to have many implications for those, but at the same time I still think these are really harmful acts by the administration, and the symbology of basically telling the federal government not to enforce the existing laws is really counterintuitive and wrong-headed.
What he said. And what I'd add to that is that if you look at the way the country and especially its political discourse has addressed gun violence, there is a real, but as Ted has just said, really very small nexus between mental illness and overall gun violence, including spree shootings. And the sudden focus on mental illness and addressing mental illness and conversations about control mechanisms to be deployed at the mentally ill in the wake of the spree shootings is, in my opinion, much less about real violence prevention policy than it is a way, again, in political discourse of drawing attention away from fundamental dynamics around violence and guns and what we can do about them. It's not nothing, but for the most part, it's a distraction.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Chaplain Michael Alvarado. I'm program supervisor for Bronx Connect's Release the Grip. I have two of my staff here with me. And we represent a cure violence program that's a part of the New York City crisis management system here. So I have a twofold question, both for Thomas and for Isabel. Just curious as to what you're presenting here today and what the key differences are between ceasefire that's being implemented here in New York, if there's any differences, and then also why not, because you did this meta research on programs that do work and are implemented, and you have cure violence that proves almost instantly once it's instituted in a target red zone that gun violence, shootings, and killings are reduced by about 50% or more. So why not employ those, because you had an employment problem, why not employ those that are most prominent to commit acts of violence that now want to turn a new leaf, those that are credible in those areas and have the influences and networks and the inroads, why not hire them to do the actual work on the ground and stop the violence on the ground?
I can start with your question, why not hire them? We had a program. We had a program in the city of Newburgh called SNUG, which was guns spelled backwards, and they were on the ground. Unfortunately, we don't have that program right now. However, I get what you're saying. We're working with, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Exodus. Exodus does work with people that have gotten in trouble in the past. We're hoping that in the future that we can get that program either back or get some folks that are working with Exodus to come on board and kind of merge the two and come up with a solution of how we can get folks on the ground that have experienced this. So it's something that we did have, and unfortunately, things happen, and we're hoping to get it back.
All right, so I don't know if you're going to like this, but here goes. So the answer to your first question, why wasn't it included in the meta review, was simply because there's never been a systematic review published about cure violence or violence interruption or street work, however you want to define it. So we didn't say anything for it or against it. But now I have a lot of experience with cure violence and cure violence programs. Funded them at the Department of Justice, administered the SNUG program for the governor. And, Gary Slutkin, who sort of pioneered this, sort of puts it pretty well, which is, I think the evidence shows that when cure violence models are implemented well with fidelity, they're successful. But when they're not implemented well, they're not successful. And actually, the state of the evidence, as I see it, and we have a number of experts here. David, we have Jeff Butts in the back, who's done great work evaluating some of the New York programs here. I would characterize the evidence in support of cure violence right now as mixed. And I actually think it's going to be very important what the next few evaluations show. And so what I would say, and basically where cure violence programs break down is often in implementation. So what typically happens in places like Pittsburgh or in some places around with SNUG is you get a couple ex-offenders who have credibility in these communities, and you just throw them out there, and you say, go reduce violence, no training, no support, no connection to other programs. And not surprisingly, that sometimes doesn't go well. And it doesn't go well because they don't have the proper support, they don't have the proper training. Sometimes they're not fully extricated from the game. You've probably heard this term, playing the 50-50. And so these are not reasons to not support street work and cure violence models. I actually think that street work is a really important sort of component to these strategies, and I hope that in a year or two I can come back and say something different. But I think that the sort of three key issues are, first of all, street work needs to be professionalized. It needs to be respected as real work that you can't just jump into, that deserves real support. People should have benefits and stuff like that. Number two, I think that we need to clarify the relationship with law enforcement. I think it's great when street workers are independent, but I think when they cross the line into adversarial, I think it ends up sort of hurting long-term legitimacy. And there are ways, without giving information, for street workers and cops to cooperate. And then the last thing is just how you engage with these groups, because sometimes when it goes wrong, the street workers are inadvertently reinforcing group or gang identities. So in Boston, where I am right now, there was this program called Street Safe. And one of the things that happened, the Street Safe program wasn't effective. And one of the things that happened was, in Boston we don't have highly organized gangs. It's, guys who grew up together, it's neighborhoods, and then, people know one another. But the street workers were very active. And so there would be a shooting, and they'd fan out, and they'd reach out to all of these networks, some of them which were very disorganized. And they'd be like, hey, you stand down, you don't need to do anything, you need to handle. And a bunch of the guys would be like, I don't even know this dude. Am I supposed to ride for him? They were actually suggesting that they were supposed to be retaliating when it hadn't actually occurred to them. And so the technical term for that is reinforcing gang identity or social, increasing the social cohesion among the group members. So long answer to a short question, but I would say that street work's a very valuable component. It's just you got to do it right, and we need more research.
Jeff, you want to get in on this? And you have a session of your own in this series coming up.
I think later, in May, I think. Thomas, you'll be surprised to know I agree with almost everything you said. But I would also point out that a lot of the criticisms about when it's done well and when it's not done well, it could be harmful and it's difficult to pull off and they make mistakes. You could say those same things about policing. So it is always a question of implementation and quality, and I really support the idea of making these more professional. We have a report coming out on cure violence, and we are including a section on how city governments often misuse and underappreciate the nonprofit sector. And that, I think, part of the key is better contracting, better continuity, because I do think all those things are applicable.
What he said.
and the research base is still mixed. And there has not been a good, rigorous study of cure violence yet. There are just a lot of impressionistic studies, so it's really hard to know what the actual effects are.
So, quickly, and then over here.
So just to add to that, because I firmly believe, not because I'm in the system, but because I'm seeing it work, that's definitely the issue, is that we're still developing the data to prove that this works. And we kind of seeing the data as it's passing along now. But to add to the point is that New York has implemented cure violence in a way that has never been implemented, in that we have wraparound services. And we're heavily focused on staff development and professionalism and training and being adequate. And one of the mantras is not only to have credible messengers, but to have suitable messengers as well. And I think what is undervalued is hiring agencies that are going to be contracted to make sure and ensure that the hiring is done well. So our particular organization, we hire very well, and we make sure that the training and our staff are equipped to handle whatever comes forward. And they're not only credible, they're suitable.
That's great.
Over here. No, hold on.
Good evening, Jessica Mofield, Mayor's Office to Prevent Gun Violence. Thank you so much for sharing, Tom and Jeff, and also Mr. Kennedy. To speak towards where the city is moving in regards to this direction to just gun violence efforts in general, in speaking in regards to the crisis management system as a whole, with the launch of the office that just took place on February 3rd, speaking towards being able to streamline contracts is something that we're definitely moving towards doing. In regards to professional development, really building out this idea of who is credible. We hear it a lot, but having a defined role as to what that means. Definitely partnering with the New School to be able to provide credits and opportunity for educational development for our workforce is definitely something that's very important. In regards to our coordination with our justice partners, specifically with NYPD, being able to work and coordinate program saturation and targeting young people who are more prone to reoffend, that happens at a higher level with the program managers. So there is communication that happens in regards to being able to maintain the credibility of the violence interrupters on the ground. That's not really seen, but what is happening is, you know, our success and our progression couldn't happen without that relationship with our justice partners. So really being involved with the People's Police Academy, when the new recruits on the ground are coming into communities, being able to receive that firsthand kind of community orientation, not only from other community members, but from the community-based organizations that we see on the ground, partnering with the Community for New York City to be able to provide workshops for our community-based organizations that are super grassroots to be able to build capacity, and then also looking at other funding opportunities to be able to implement funding for our unofficial mayors of our city and community members that want to be empowered and able to impact public safety in a very strategic and targeted way. We'll be releasing grant opportunity as well called Safe in the City. So I mean, when we talk about, I guess, the evolution of it, and then once Jeff presents the background for it, being able to look at aligning all of these strategies together to be able to have a strong, multifaceted approach to how New York City is essentially the pioneer of being able to drive down gun violence. Because I believe 2016 was the first time that we've seen under 1,000 shootings for the year. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thanks. Here, and I'm just going to say this question and then one more.
It's a comment more than a question. And just, I'm with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, been working on legislative advocacy. Just to Thomas's point about a constituency, I think one of the things that has been a criticism of the movement has been a little bit removed from some of the issues that are more, relevant to these populations that are most at risk. And just, so I think a lot of groups are rethinking their legislative advocacy agenda, which we are, in fact. So we're trying to, in addition to the laws we want, whether it's safe storage, or for domestic violence, et cetera, including funding for programs that actually work, like these guys have been talking about. So I think that's a really positive, very positive direction. And it came out of PICO and the Law Center for Gun Violence Prevention wrote that really good report recently, and a lot of us have read that. So that's one, just a comment. The other is there a possibility we can get slides for this? I know a lot of my members would love to get this information, and just wondered how we go about that. Thank you very much.
Thomas will sell them to you for a minimal fee.
Yeah, I just a comment to your comment. This is actually something that I've been sort of really pleased by, is that I think that the sort of broader sort of gun violence prevention work that was quite disconnected from urban violence reduction in the past has really been increasingly connected. And Ted, I credit you and other colleagues with doing that. And I think I was thinking about it just as we were talking. I think what we never want to happen again is what happened with Mike. When he and my friend Reverend Jeff Brown, when they went to the White House, and they were told, in the midst of this Sandy Hook thing, that we're not going to take care of your people. We're just going to focus. We're just going to stay focused on this, because there sadly will be another Sandy Hook, and so I think we've got to sort of pledge to each other that whoever gets in the door first, that they pull the other group behind, and I think that that's happening.
Okay, I'd like to ask Ted a question. And I'm not an expert in the gun area, but whenever I see statements coming from your organization or most organizations in the gun field, it just seems excruciatingly polite and cautious to me. And is there an organization that I just don't know of that I just want some ruthless bastards to go after the NRA and the Second Amendment and call for the abolition of the Second Amendment? Is anyone doing that?
Well, you're criticizing me for being such a nice guy, so. Well, let me, I think Everytown for gun safety, as I said, was created and founded on the premise that gun violence is something that we have to address, all of us together, that it's really, it is impacted by the behaviors of Americans that live in diverse circumstances and have diverse relationships with their neighbors and with the wider world and with firearms. And so it's definitely been written into our kind of DNA that we're not just representing the residents of New York City, we're not just representing where I live in Bed-Stuy. We have to represent folks who live on a range in Montana or New Mexico. And when we look to the solutions that we want to achieve, we want them to be evidence-based, we want to make a difference, but we also want them to be democratic. I think when we come to these solutions, and I think if anything, maybe this political environment right now is showing we can make changes in the laws and the policies and the way we allocate resources, but it's not so durable if you don't have a lot of Americans behind you. Social change really, it goes deeper than laws and then programs and anything that we're doing directly. And we're trying to make durable change. So clearly we try and take a middle of the road position, I guess, something where we think all Americans can be behind, that we think we can reduce gun violence and support the Second Amendment. Now, it sounds like, but I recognize there's a lot of diversity of views that individuals have within America and frankly within Everytown. Personally, among our staff, obviously everybody comes to us from a different issue. And I think that there are increasingly, as this movement has grown, there's more room for specialization and for diversity within it and to have those kinds of viewpoints represented. And I would point you to one called Guns Down, which is an organization more, I think, at this point in name than in structure, but it's run by a former employee of Everytown. And I think they have made a number of public announcements about their existence under really the idea that fundamentally, firearm violence in the United States has to do with guns and perhaps the number and accessibility of them for all Americans. So anyway, I would point you in that direction if you're looking for someone with a little bit more spark.
So I'm going to guess that my friends up here will stick around and continue the conversation. But here endeth our formal program. If you would join me in thanking my friends up here.